Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such,
Hello again.
and this week we are going to explore questions from listeners that have come in over the last while, but it's been a while since we've really addressed any on the podcast. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
The past week or two, I've been reading and then rereading a really fascinating new paper from, apologies for pronunciation, Maria Korochkina and Kathleen Rassel, friend of the pod, Professor Kathleen Rassel. It's called Morphology in Children's Books and What It Means for Learning. And it's one of a few papers I've read recently that look at a corpus of children's books and what we can learn from that. And this one in particular looks at, it studies in particular affixes and the environments in which we find them in children's books from a really large collection of children's books around, I think it was 1200 or so. And from that, it derives principles for how we might consider the teaching of morphology. So, for example, some affixes are often found in words where the other parts of the word that complement them make it quite difficult to recognize the meaning of that affix, whereas other ones, it's really obvious that this affix is doing a job. So, for example, in the word inconsistent, we can see what in is doing because the word consistent is really clear. But for pupils, at least, a word like subvert, it becomes a little bit more tricky to work out what's going on there. And so it's a fascinating paper and potentially, I think, one that anyone interested in the English language, in reading more broadly, especially the teaching of spelling and vocabulary, is going to want to check it out. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Nice. That sounds really interesting. I think when I came across those words in my teaching career, wasn't really sure what to do with them. So I'm assuming that the end goal here is going to be how can we change our practice. I've been reading Fahrenheit 182, which is Mark Hoppus, the bass player from Blink-182's memoir. I don't think it's really going to be of interest unless you were born in a certain time and sort of came of age at the turn of the century. But I've got this one called China's War with Japan, 1937 to 1945, because obviously, I try to read it further away from where we are as possible. But I came across this book and the idea that World War II started in 1937 and we don't really give enough credence to the sort of the Asian perspective with regards to our recollection of World War II. Really, really fascinating. So, great book. Definitely recommend that. It's great to have you back, Chris. It's been a while, and we're going to field questions from listeners. I mean, the first one has come in quite a few times. They want to remain anonymous, but they say recently, Chris, you've been on lots of other podcasts. They're all rubbish, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, well, comparatively, they are rubbish. They're all rubbish. None of them are in the same league as thinking deeply about primary education, but they do have the advantage of inviting me on, and I'm a sucker for my own voice, so I will be on anything, anytime.
No, I'm only messing. But I have seen a couple. There was one with John and Emma, wasn't there? Mind the Gap. Is that recently? And then it was Chris Passy. Did I see a video of that online?
Darren Leslie as well. I've been on a few Zach Rochelle. I've basically been cheating on this podcast. That's what you're getting at, and I respect it.
No, I just thought it'd be funny to mention it. No, but I mean, because you've been spreading the good word about your second book, and yeah, I mean, I'm because I knew Darren was going to bring. Was that on the Scottish Education podcast or was it on his Becoming Educated podcast?
The latter, yeah, becoming educated.
All right, because I knew that was coming back, but then I don't know what's wrong with my Blue Sky. I don't really see anything of interest on it, so I've missed that. So I'm going to check that out actually because that'll be really really good. I know Darren thinks really deeply about his podcast as well, so I'm sure he asks really fantastic questions.
Yeah, I've been really lucky. The podcasts I've been on recently, like joking aside, how the fact that they've all been really thoughtful questions, but they've all come from slightly different angles that I, in a lot of cases, hadn't expected, which is, kind of what we're going to be doing here today. So yeah, I'm just grateful to be invited on that sort of thing.
I have chosen questions, at least two of the three, that fit your area of specialism, but the first one's a bit more broad. And it was from Charles Bankovitz, long-time listener, a couple of times speaker at TDAPE conferences. And he says, going through test papers a few days later with the whole class, yeah or nay? Where do you stand, Chris?
Going to go with the super boring answer of it depends. So let me say what I wouldn't do. I won't say that I've never done it, but from bitter experience, one thing I wouldn't do, I wouldn't sit pupils down. They've got their own copy of the paper that they did in front of them, and I wouldn't then go through question by question, either getting them to mark the questions as a time saving, an understandable time saving thing for busy teachers. I wouldn't do that, but equally I wouldn't, even if I'd marked it, go through the entire paper with them having the paper in front of them either, because in the first case you are asking pupils to face, in some cases, how badly they've done on a test paper, and that's got to be a really difficult thing to do, and they're having to mark it themselves, and that can lead to real unpleasant issues for those kids. Or you're putting a completed test paper in front of kids, and even if some kids have done really, really well, if they've got 39 out of 40 written on the front of the paper, and you want to productively get them to rethink about those questions, then they're just going to switch off. As soon as they see that you're talking about a question they got full marks on, even if they got lucky and they took a guess, they're just going to switch off. So I wouldn't go through an entire paper in that way. In fact, I would very rarely consider going through an entire paper at all. What I might do are one of these two things. If, and this is primarily something I do in year 6, if I wanted pupils to be familiarized with the nature of an assessment so that they can feel confident going into an assessment. So in, say, the weeks before a SAT, I want kids to really feel like they know what they're doing, so they won't feel intimidated by the whole thing. Then I might go through a paper. But what I'd likely do, even if they had completed the paper themselves days before, I would still model it. I would still not let them have papers in front of them. And I might go through 5 or 6 questions at a time, showing how I would answer them, what I might do if this question was particularly tricky, how I might leave that. Basically learning about test strategy and the structure of an assessment. But I'd only do that in small chunks. I think if you do that for more than about 10 or 15 minutes, you just lose kids for obvious reasons. So I might do that, where I'm modeling how to deal with the structure of a paper. Another thing I might do is and this is possibly more likely with the grammar paper or with, say, a mathematics assessment of some kind, I might see a paper and think, you know what, there are 4 or 5 really interesting questions in there that lots of my kids struggled with, or maybe lots of them got it right, but got it right in a different way, and I want to show them another method or whatever it might be. I might pick out some questions and maybe use 1 or 2 of them as a starter at the start of a lesson. And to say, okay, we're just going to have a look at this because it was really interesting, and perhaps even do some guided and independent practice with similar questions if I wanted to do that. One thing I probably wouldn't do too much of, though, is looking at the questions they'd got wrong and overanalyzing via some sort of question level analysis to say, oh, I need to go through this paper so that they'll suddenly get this bit of fractions and this bit of ratio and this bit of statistics or whatever it might be. So in short, I might do it, but I do it in small bites, and I would think really carefully about why I was doing it. It's either test familiarity or going through some particularly interesting questions that pupils might have struggled with.
Nice, I like that. I'd be a fan of the back end of the paper, and maybe looking at connections between it and the questions and different types of questions. Because obviously, like if you're using previous SATs papers, the whole point is that they ask the same mathematics but in a different way. It's not like GCSE paper where you can predict the type of question that's going to come up on the paper. So almost looking at, well, why have they put those 2 bits of maths together? how can we use what we know kind of situation. So yeah, but other than that, I not really much to add, because I think you're right. I think I've certainly in the past done the whole paper and got found those diminished returns very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's what I find as well. Very quickly diminishing returns on that stuff. It's the perfect phrase for it.
So the next one is almost like an amalgamation of a couple of questions that sort of hit on the same thing. And I think, if memory serves me right, you may mention this towards the middle of Primary Reading Simplified. So, like, if you were mentoring a newly appointed literacy lead, what micro steps would you recommend for the first sort of 12 weeks? What's that, the first big term? So the staff begin using the new reading lesson structure with fidelity, yet still feel ownership of the change.
It partly depends where we're coming from here. So you mentioned reading lesson structures there. Very briefly, or as briefly as I can, I think I'll need to go back a step and explain what reading lesson structures are, where they come from. That will take me about a minute, so here goes. So the teaching of reading that follows phonics, I think, largely can be boiled down to three principles, these three things that we need to address. One of them is we need to develop pupils as fluent readers through scaffolded decoding practice that can be provided by things like repeated reading. So we need to develop fluency, in other words. The second thing we need to do is give pupils a huge variety of reading experiences. Meaningful reading experiences, often of whole texts, are ideal. And the third thing that we need to do is we need to engage pupils in deeper text discussions so that they become more strategic in their reading, and so that we can teach them about common language structures that will appear time and again. So those three things that we need to do. One way of addressing that I talk about in Primary Reading Simplified and makes up the heart of the book is what I call reading lesson structures. Tried and tested ways of addressing those three priorities. A fluency read, which is basically repeated oral reading with a bit of modeling and a bit of performance and discussion, addresses fluency. Extended read is where the teacher takes charge of the reading, reads aloud at pace. Over time, as pupils become more fluent, engages them in some independent reading as well to incrementally and intentionally build reading stamina. And in order to do deeper text discussions, I have a reading lesson structure that's common to lots of schools called a close read. So and that is based around questioning an interesting chunk of text, often a part of something we've read in its entirety. So with that in mind, if I'm working with a new literacy lead and they are keen to implement reading lesson structures, and as you mentioned, there is a chapter on professional development and another one on implementation in the book. If I'm working with them, it depends. So it's another depends answer. Sorry about that. It depends on the assumption that they are, maybe they've heard about reading lesson structures, they think it's a good idea, but their knowledge of where these come from, what the rationale behind them is, the related research, if that isn't there, then the first thing to do, and this might be the entire 12 weeks, is to build up their understanding one way or another. So that begins with supporting them to understand the related research, getting them to read key texts and key bits of evidence that relate to each of these three priorities that I mention. Once they've understood that, the next thing to do is to check that, on the assumption, as you say, that they are a new literacy lead, that they necessarily need to implement reading lesson structures. Reading lesson structures address those three priorities, but once every often I come across a school who have taken a completely different approach that do also address those three priorities really well. And the last thing I'd want this new literacy lead to do is to touch anything that seems to be working and that seems to be doing what it needs to do. But on the assumption that they've taken some time, and I've encouraged them to take some time to find out exactly how reading works in their current school and to find out whether or not it does need some editing, the next thing I do is get them to be a scout. Them and perhaps a colleague, I would get them to have a go, basically, at each of the three reading lesson structures in their own classroom, probably one at a time for a few weeks each, experiment with each one, ideally with a teacher working in another key stage as well, experiment with them one at a time, work out how it works, get a handle on them, get relatively confident with them so that they can do what comes next. However, if this teacher is basically already past that stage, they're already familiar with reading lesson structures. They're already comfortable teaching them, and I imagine there's a chance that when the person posed this question, this was where they were coming from. They're thinking of someone who already knows their stuff, who are already comfortable with reading lesson structures. What would I guide them to do step by step? The first thing I'd guide them to do is to find out the opinions of their colleagues about the current way of teaching reading. What do they like about it? What do they not like about it? How do they plan it? If reading were to change, what components would they be desperate to keep? What would they be really keen to get rid of, etc. Just get a sense of the lay of the land. And then once they had an understanding of that, I would want them to work with their colleagues to share the rationale for change and to share with them this underlying theory of what reading is, how it develops, and what research suggests about how we can most effectively facilitate that. And then we get on the assumption that that takes a few weeks at least. We might have a few weeks left of those 12 to start thinking about practical application of reading lesson structures with that body of staff. And it's really kind of a repetition of that scouting that they did. So I would want them to first model one reading lesson structure, probably fluency read first, to model that with their staff to make it really clear that it isn't a particularly impossible thing to do. In fact, to do it adequately is really achievable, but there's loads of room for growth. I'd want them to model it for staff and then to give their colleagues 2 or 3 weeks with that reading lesson structure to just experiment with it once or twice a week in their own classroom and to get comfortable with it. And then to offer feedback to say, well, I've tried it in my classroom. I found this, or it was really good, but I think on a Tuesday, I'm really going to need support from the teaching assistant that's in the partner's classroom because yada, yada, yada. All those roadblocks that you can address only when you experiment with something in practice. So I'd want them to do that with fluency read. And then on the assumption that colleagues start to feel fairly confident with the fluency read, I'd want them to do the same thing with extended read. So model it in a staff meeting or in some of the professional development session, and then work with colleagues to give them the chance to experiment with it. And then if there's time in the 12 weeks, though there's likely not to be, we don't want to rush, they would do the same thing with a close read. And only once colleagues have grown comfortable with all 3 of those reading lesson structures do we start to say, okay, let's implement all 3 of these across a reading week in different proportions depending on the needs of our pupils across the school. And it's only once teachers are really comfortable with this way of teaching that you then say, this is how we teach reading now. And from then, the micro steps are about observing teachers, offering feedback, providing support, and partnering teachers up so that they can work with each other if one's maybe a bit more experienced, a bit more expert, maybe one's an ECT who could do with a bit more support. Now, I know there's a lot there, but the very short version, if we assume that this person already knows their stuff about reading lesson structures and the underlying theory, and knows how to do them themselves, it's really about taking each of these reading lesson structures one at a time and letting their colleagues learn about them, see them modeled clearly, and then experiment with them. And all of that is, of course, preceded by finding out what staff currently think and sharing the rationale for change so that everyone's on board.
You mentioned there that they may not get through all of them in 12 weeks. Do you have a rough ballpark for how long you think actually we could be up and running with this in, say, February of an academic year, or do you think it might be a bit longer, or does it depend, as always?
I'm tempted to say it depends, but I think as a general rule, on the assumption that let's say that you've done all of that early work and you know that your colleagues are ready for change, they understand the rationale for change, and you're just thinking, okay, now let's make this work. I think it's perfectly possible to look at a reading structure and experiment with it over the course of, say, 3 or 4 weeks. And so I think it's perfectly possible that across a term, you could practice and get feedback on and get confident with all three reading lesson structures across a term, so that at the start of the next term, that's when you roll them out just as the way that you teach reading. Now, just something to bear in mind here is that one of the advantages of this is that teachers can experiment with these reading lesson structures just on 1 or 2 days a week, while keeping what they're used to and what they're comfortable with and what maybe they already have planning for say 3 or maybe even 4 days a week while they're doing that experimentation. I think the last thing I want teachers to do is to be experimenting with something new and having to plan a whole week's worth of teaching that way from scratch, even though reading lesson structures by design are not particularly costly in terms of time to prepare. But yeah, I think it's perfectly possible to wrap your head around it and get comfortable with these 3 reading lesson structures across a term. By the way, there is a 4th reading lesson structure that's kind of introductory for year 1, but that can be learned at the same time by year 1 teachers. But yeah, I think it's perfectly possible to wrap your head around it, get confident with them across 12 weeks or across a term, and then be ready to kind of hit the ground running at the start of the next term. That's generally what I advise. I think it can be done slightly quicker. I think there perhaps are advantages for taking it slightly slower, but I think that works pretty well.
Nice. I mean, just as I'm listening to you describe this plan for implementation, I reckon the people who are asking that question are doing the LT and they're trying to get a heads up on the assignment. And they're hoping that reading comes up as the.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, it could be they're getting me to do their MPQ for them, which, you know, if they can transcribe it, fair enough.
Yeah, because they put. I mean, the transcript exists on different platforms. Then you just go here, turn this into an assignment. Here's the question.
Well, just in case someone is listening and thinking about it in those terms, one thing I didn't mention is the creation of an implementation plan. Partly because I kind of take for granted that I've created an implementation plan that schools can use and adapt in the book itself. And the other thing I didn't mention is what you do at the end, but I just figured you wouldn't get time for that in 12 weeks. Once teachers have got confident with it and they've rolled it out, it's really important to check, you know, are teachers still doing it? Are they comfortable with it? Do they need help? And over the longer term, or at least the medium to long term, are we getting out of it what we'd hoped to get out of it? And if not, why not?
Nice. That is excellent salesmanship, because you don't mind if they cheat, but they have to buy your book to get the full benefit of the cheat. And that's excellent.
Exactly. You want an implementation plan? Buy my book.
Fantastic. Do you write the questions, or is it a team for Ambition who write the NPQs?
Well, I did write some NPQL questions back a while ago, but not the 4 ones that are out now. No, that would have been for previous cohorts.
Cool. I think the Ambition ones always look really good to me. They're always really focused on the big picture implementation. So, you know, whenever I see the maths ones, I think, you know, it feels like John and Emma have been involved in some respect, but obviously I don't know that.
Yeah, and like little reminder that the episodes that John and Emma were on Thinking Deeply a few weeks back, superb stuff. I mean, I'm so genuinely very grateful to work with people like that on a Monday and Tuesday at Ambition. It's super. It's one of the best parts of the job.
Yeah, they're lovely as well. I mean, I remember reading the expert edit and thinking we were going to do one episode. I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to cram this all into one. So hopefully that's the start of many appearances from those guys on the pod. And so I think we've got time for one more. Again, reading focused. After pupils achieve fluent decoding, which is something we've stressed quite a bit on the podcast over the years, what routines cultivate disciplinary reading, if that exists, and how can teachers embed those routines without sacrificing curriculum breadth or depth?
People who are really into reading and reading research tend to devour loads of it and get really interested in every aspect of it. And I was interested in disciplinary reading for a period of time, and there's a temptation to assume that everything applies, you know, that everything that you can get your hands on applies to a primary level. And I'm not convinced that what's usually described as disciplinary reading needs to be a huge focus at primary level, because disciplinary reading, for listeners who are unfamiliar with the term, is the idea that we want pupils to engage with texts in ways that align with particular academic disciplines. To put it in simple terms, to read like a scientist or read like a historian. What I think is that at a primary level, as long as we are giving pupils opportunities, I should say, to read across the curriculum, and so we are building reading into history and geography and religious education, etc. And if we're getting pupils to engage with those texts in a way that makes sure they are thinking about the audience that it was written for, the purpose that a text was written for, if we do those things, I think we end up introducing the ideas of disciplinary literacy without feeling like we have to explicitly focus on it or explicitly build it into our curriculum. Because if, say, we're in a history lesson and we get pupils to engage with a particular artifact that's been written, and we then say, oh, okay, so who's written this? What purpose have they written it for? And we maybe start getting into discussions about whether or not this aligns with other artifacts that we've seen, or whether there's a particular perspective that comes from that person. Then inherently we are starting to read like a historian. Equally, if we are looking at something in science, even if we're reading about the biography of a notable scientist, which doesn't feel like it would be really disciplinary literacy in that sense. We wouldn't be reading like a scientist necessarily. But if we read about it, and then what we then are interested in deriving from it is what they, the experiments that they did, what they found, the theories that they derived from the observations that they made. Again, inherently, we are nudging pupils towards what otherwise would be called disciplinary literacy. So I think as long as we're getting kids to read across the curriculum, as long as we are engaging them with the audience and purpose of those texts, and as long as we are reading in those subjects for a reason, so i.e. it's a science lesson and we're reading about this scientist for a good reason, I think it's very difficult not to inherently and unintentionally almost engage pupils in this disciplinary literacy. I think it's more of a concern for secondary schools, exactly how we might engage pupils with the reading of a scientific journal and how we might get them to look at the methods of that, say. So, yeah, that's a slightly long-winded way of saying I think we can do disciplinary literacy without having to explicitly focus on it and worry about it too much at primary school.
Julie Riseup did a really good job of sort of expressing why it's beneficial in the context of writing on the podcast a while ago. And I can see how the grammar curriculum ties in with the grammatical choices those sort of those different professions or sort of subject specialists might take. What we don't want to do is we don't want to start shoehorning things in just for the sake of it, or because they feel sort of like they're, we're raising the bar. Sort of, it has to be very, very carefully chosen decisions. And I think you've done a really good job of explaining why perhaps not necessary.
Just one thing maybe to add is that the reason why I think I wouldn't say I'm skeptical of it at primary school, because as I say, disciplinary reading and disciplinary writing are an important part of primary education. It's just that I think that focusing on it explicitly, being a literacy leader who learns about it, taking up professional development time to support your teachers to understand it, I can think of no school that I've ever encountered where that would be a worthwhile priority, because it's so far down the list compared to almost every other aspect of literacy that I can think of. So it's not that it's necessarily like a valueless thing to do. It's just that I think in practice, it's so far down the list of priorities that as long as we are getting kids to engage with the audience and purpose of texts across the curriculum, we're squeezing like 99% of the value out of it anyway.
We managed to get through those in really good time, Chris. And even with some cuts, I think we got a nice tidy episode. Hopefully he'll be back again soon. I'll send a list of of different topics that are on the horizon, and maybe you can sort of return to your co-host duties after your world tour of other people's podcasts.
I mean, do you know? Just as a suggestion, I would love it if we could get a massive list of questions about reading. I would be in hog's heaven answering those. So if the Discord or if on Blue Sky or if I can find a way to accumulate a shed load of questions and send them your way, if it's something you fancy doing on the pod, I think that might be a worthwhile use of our time.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, like yeah. So stick those in whatever comment section you're listening to. I mean, it's been like a year since anyone left a review on Apple Podcasts. So if anyone wants to leave a review, that'd be absolutely fantastic because the more people who see those, the more people likely to listen and join us in the evidence informed primary camp. But we shall we'll see. I digress. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on again, Kieran.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.